Hey, welcome to Leadership Within, the moment for leaders to reflect on their human experience of leadership. I'm your host, TK, and I'm joined by
Vanessa.
Hey, Vanessa. Lovely to have you as always, and great to actually meet you for the recording session. I hope we'll have a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So, we've been talking about what this episode might be, and it's actually inspired by a couple of clients, a couple of situations that I've been facing. So, there's an interesting case, interesting situation that happens actually quite often, especially when, as a leader, you're someone that, sets high standards for yourself. And what happens is, even if you want to apply the coaching mindset to leadership, as in, help people with questions, have the unconditional regard for their well-being and that they're doing their best, when you're setting high standards for yourself, it's obviously, and for many, quite difficult to look at people, failing, not meeting the targets and expectations you've both agreed. And even if you say nothing, sometimes the judgment, the way you look, the way you're critical, can be felt. I don't know if you've experienced it yourself as a leader or even as someone looking up to leaders.
I think probably I'm bound to say yes.
Mm.
Where I've had an experience where the words don't necessarily match the feeling that I get, and maybe someone isn't giving themselves permission to really say it straight or whatever else. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I can access moments like that.
And I can access moments when I've been a party that's been judging and people felt like, I've been judgmental at times. It's a difficult one because especially even if you do your best, sometimes a part of your demeanor can actually, trigger someone. Someone can feel judged. And it's obviously quite a no-no, quite a significant problem when within a coaching relationship, but it's also quite a problem if you're a leader of someone, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, judgment is one of those really sticky things, isn't it? Because once we're in it, we're only going to see things that reinforce our judgment. So it's one of those ladder of inference things, isn't it?
The
Where we get
self-fulfilling
stuck.
prophecy too,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So one thing that I've noticed is, once we're used to judging, it's something that's very hard to get out of. As leaders, some people just do it by instinct, just, as a matter of course, they will just give you the look or, use a specific tone, even if they might do their best not to. It's quite incongruent, but it does not create an atmosphere of safety. So I'm wondering, like, if you're in a situation or you've seen people in a situation or any of your clients have been in them, what happens when someone feels judged in, for instance, a workplace from the leader?
Yeah, I think it gets personal very quickly. So I think the person that's judging, there's a personal that something's been triggered. So there's something there, and I think for the person on the receiving end, it feels
Mm-hmm.
very personal. So I think the objectivity is missing, and therefore I kind of almost feel like we're on a bit of a hiding to nothing from that point on until we're really willing to kind of go, wow, I'm judging here.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to get curiosity and learning into that space.
It is, but many leaders, and the challenge is so many leaders believe that it's one of their core responsibility to be the one that provides expectation and judge if they're being fulfilled or not. But the challenge is it removes safety. And there are
Yes.
many leaders that believe that, safety is not a prerequisite for performance. So I'm wondering, like from your point of view, if you believe that safety, and I do, is quite important. I mean, the psychological safety for people to bring themselves fully at work. What happens if it's not present? What consequences have you, for instance, seen or might be a part of?
I think I mean, the consequences I see
Mm.
are you get gossip, you get drama, you get all sorts of things, acting out when there's judgment flying around.
Mm.
Because people are enrolling other people, and there's
Okay.
lots of kind of voting going on, even if it's not very obvious. So, for me, it is, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think about the whole psychological safety bit, and I think, okay, so
Mm.
if we kind of think about we build safety in moments of trust. It's like it's not quite so definitive for me. Like, oh, it's either psychologically safe or it's
Mm-hmm.
not. I think of the work that I do in different places, and you know, I can feel safe in certain conversations and less safe in others. And often there's something that's maybe being triggered in me in those moments where I feel less safe. And actually, maybe I'm doing the judging in those moments. I'm making assumptions, and that's therefore contributing to the safety of the group. So I think it's oversimplistic for us sometimes to just think, okay, this is a safe workplace. This isn't a safe workplace. I think it's more about we're constantly evolving our trust with each other, and we may have. So I'm just, like I said, I'm just thinking of an
Mm-hmm.
example. I've got an example where I worked with someone this week, and we were given a really confusing brief, and it wasn't clear who ultimately had the ability to make the decision. So in
Okay.
other words, we had to consensus it and come to some kind of agreement, and we didn't agree with the where we felt we were taking the design and where it should go. And we're friends, or friendly with each other, so there's a care for the relationship. But in a situation like that, I notice in me, when I can feel someone digging their heels in, that I then start having a judgmental conversation in my head about that person.
Mm.
And in that moment, I think we both absolutely felt it, both fearful of what that might mean, both unwilling to kind of let go. So how do we do it? And I think the only way I could face into that was to actually name what's going on and saying, look, I see we've got really different viewpoints here, and at the moment we're pulling one way or another. And in almost naming it, that's what starts to release the judgment a little bit, because I'm telling on myself, and then
Mm.
I'm inviting the other person to tell on their self, and then say, how are we going to do this? But I think I think our relationship helped for us to be able to do that with each other. Would I have done that with someone that I had less in the emotional bank account with? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's tricky. I think I don't think we ever get to a point where you know, we don't have judgment in the space.
And that's the thing, right? And some things are just maybe so difficult to remove completely, and you can't be, perfectly shut off from this. What it brings to mind for me is the fact that it's like some difficult topics in conversations. I know politics, religion, race, and some people just are so afraid of overstepping the boundary that they prefer to stay away from it
Yeah.
completely. And it might be the same with judgment, right? If we are conscious of the fact that judgment can destroy trust, can really damage this relationship, like trying not to think about elephants is not
Yeah.
something that might help
No, I
us,
mean,
right? So,
it's like we all know that our brain is going to make those assumptions
hmm.
and judgments, because that's just how we're wired. So I think sometimes I often see teams, for example,
Yeah.
really trying hard to create a social contract that says, we will never judge, we will never gossip, we will never do that, and it's like, oh, come on, guys, like this isn't reality. Like we are going to have moments of that, but can we unzip in those moments and kind of reveal, oh wow, I notice we're doing this thing, without it being, you're doing this. I think I was listening to a conversation with a group of leaders yesterday,
Hmm.
and one of the things that they were saying helps them get out of judgmental or defensive behavior is to find the we. we're doing this, we're in this together. And I think my advice would always be, don't set yourself up with unrealistic expectations of, we will create judgment-free spaces. I just, I've never worked in one. Have you?
Well, not really. I mean, no, sadly not. I think I remember trying to create one with some people, and for a while it was amazing until I touched upon a topic that one person found really touchy, right? Something that I wasn't, maybe, I'm not saying I overstepped, but this was definitely something that, was a bit of a scar for a certain person. And even though I had no ill intention, it broke down. And I think, I inadvertently destroyed something. I actually, it's an interesting one because I've just seen this person on LinkedIn today, and I was remembering this situation, and it's so serendipitous to talk about that today. But the interesting thing is how much vulnerability it takes to say, oh, I'm right now, judging.
Yeah.
I'm in this mindset that I have a certain opinion about you. I mean, this also doesn't exist that
But
much,
how
does it?
powerful is that, right? For me to say, wow, I'm having an opinion about this. I'm noticing that I'm doing that. I kind of think that's super cool that someone can do that, because it does, like, it exposes yourself. And I know I'm being probably a bit weird here, but I'm redoing my yoga teacher training, and
Yes.
one of the things that I persistently learn through my practice is how much judgment shows up in me. Like, oh, I can't do that pose, this is hard, I'm bored, I don't like the instruction. It goes on and on and on, right? And that's the beauty of yoga, it's showing me that. But it's like, okay, the idea that you and I, for example, if you're my leader, will have a judgment-free zone where that never shows up is totally unrealistic, because it's showing up in me already. As a human, I'm judging myself, and I haven't met many humans who aren't doing that. So it's, to me, I don't know, it's just one of those things that it's like, okay, if we accept judgment is going to be here, and it is going to trigger our threat responses. So when it does, how are we going to be? That to me seems like a more fruitful conversation than how are we going to remove this thing called judgment.
That's a good one, right? So how do we deal with the judgment that can't be removed because it never can? And, interestingly, when I think about the classical ways of, acting and formal advice that might be given, it's more about hiding the judgment, using different forms of communication than actually addressing it when there is one.
I know, exactly. So it's like, I'm going to pretend because I'm going to smile here, and I'm going to assume that, that you are not going to read anything in my body language, that says, actually, do you know what? I'm judging this or this situation. It's like, it's fallacy, isn't it? Like, we're going to pick the cues up.
And yet it's a part of this normal social contract. Right? That we're doing, you've said something about, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could openly talk about it? And yet we don't. All right. Somehow we developed into a society that does not necessarily, create these spaces. As you say, they rarely exist, if any. Right. So in my mind, like, what is it that we see? What's the natural human instinct? I guess it's like, fear and staying away from risk that actually prevents us from normalizing it.
Yeah, I think, like, we don't like to admit when we're under stress, for a start, so we kind of act as if we've got all our shit together, which isn't helpful in itself. So if we can't recognize we're under stress, we then don't recognize that we've gone to judgment. And again, I was listening to people talk about trust day before yesterday, and what creates it, and how do you know when it's there? And, and so often I hear people say, I trust you. I've said it, I trust you, but I mean, like, you think about you and I, we trust each other, I hope. And there will be moments where trust is less present than it normally is, because I might be stressed, and something in something you say or do might trigger me, and then there's less trust there. So it's like I just think realism is probably what we need most at the moment in leadership, rather than ideals.
That's quite true. The sad reality of it is that, it's not necessarily the most practical thing. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
saying being real isn't practical. It's that, we probably, what I think, we might want to give our listeners is, what's the advice? What is the actual thing that they can do in these situations? Because, I am not a huge fan of saying, well, just be real, just accept it, or just, roll with it. Or one client said something, oh, I'm nurturing my employees. What are you actually doing then? What does it really mean? And what I'm thinking is, maybe take a pause, right? If you find yourself judging, if you find yourself using the typical tricks of saying one thing but actually thinking another, maybe take a pause, right? Maybe say, well, backtrack, and it will show some vulnerability. But the one thing to do is, if it's happening, don't continue, because I guess you're digging yourself even a bigger hole.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I've said, notice where you're judging yourself. I mean, that's the starting point, isn't it? Because if you're judging yourself, then it's going on inside you, and you will be doing the same outside of you, because that's just, that's what's going to happen.
Just natural, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But it was funny because, so I was in this thing yesterday, and at the end we left a closing question around what makes you powerful as a leader, because we've been talking about empowerment and what was powerful in the group, and then of course at the end they asked us to share what we thought. Now normally if someone had said what makes you powerful, I might have gone, oh, my intuition, my sensitivity. But the word I actually used for myself was curiosity. Because I actually think, I'm not saying I lead with that all the time, but I do think it's like a superpower for leadership, and that kind of keeping me out of the state. So if I can notice, like I'm thinking in black and white and I can feel the judgment come up, can I lean into the part of me that's curious and thinks, I wonder what's going on over there, or I wonder what they just heard me say? Because a lot of the time I notice I might say something and someone hears something different to what I intended. And I think if I can kind of sit in that space in between and get curious, that's a superpower for me.
Which is a great one. Although I'm not using you as an example, many people actually struggle with that. It's not about being curious. I know a person that applies curiosity in that sense, but through asking questions, through embodying and showing up in a curious fashion, some people might find that this person is interrogating them. It's asking all these questions, has some sort of an agenda, because, well, who asks all these questions, right? And what this person does that I'm referring to is saying sorry every other sentence, just to make sure that, it's like he's not bothering anyone. And what I find is, I sometimes feel like, okay, I'm being curious, but I'm trying to figure out something that I want to know. That's a bit of my agenda, how this person is, why this has happened, or why this person is reacting in a certain way. We can't necessarily influence how the other person feels, but through these questions, they might also feel judged, even if we only have curiosity.
So I would argue, are you really curious in those situations? Because what I'm hearing you say is there is a view, there is a, and I think, most leaders, when they're learning coaching questions or skills and the skill of curiosity, think that they're being curious when they have an opinion and they're asking questions that get you to that opinion. And that's what I remember, that being one of my first kind of like, but I'm, and then that part of my ego, but I'm right, I know the answer. And I think if I can notice that I'm attached in some way, often like, so I'm kind of thinking of myself and thinking, sometimes the thing that annoys me about myself is I don't own my opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to offend someone or piss them off or whatever else, right? And I don't want to come across as it's my way or the highway. And actually, when I don't own my opinions, that's when I can probably get a bit sneaky with my curiosity. Because do you know what I mean? So there's the part for me that says, I have an opinion here. Are you open to hearing it? And then, oh, and what's yours? Versus the part of me that is naturally like, oh, something's just happened, like, okay, let's like really slow it down and get wildly curious without any agenda. And I think that's such a, it takes a lot of skill and emotional regulation to be able to do that, right?
So, as you say, it's not something that, all of our listeners would be able to, go into right off the bat. But as you're doing it, as you're quite well practiced, how can you actually tell yourself if you have an opinion underneath? And maybe this is something that can help our listeners detect that too.
I definitely know when I've got an opinion, because often I will think, like, it will sound like it's not clear. I'm right. Like, why aren't they going in this direction? It will be quite definitive in its, in the direction of travel. Whereas when I am curious, I don't know where we're going, and I don't really care. I'm just wanting to, it's like picking up a rock and going, oh, what's underneath here then? Like I'm not trying to move it in a particular direction. Whereas definitely when I've got an opinion, there's a direction of travel that I want to get to.
I often, ask myself, how open do I feel that I might be wrong here? Right. And if I have an opinion, I was just like, okay, well, how attached am I to this? How would I feel if I was proven wrong? Whatever that means, right? And I use it quite a lot to actually detach myself. It is quite interesting when people talk to me, when I interact with people, when they see me like adapting, sometimes to conflicting points of view. It's like, okay, this might happen, but this is also a possibility. Probably this, but who knows?
So it happened to me yesterday where someone said to me, they'd said a statement and it had should in the statement, and it was a question and I thought, I don't think that's the right question. So I shared it and I said, I'm wondering if you're asking yourself the right question here, and maybe there's another way to ask this question. And the person came back and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, so like this isn't word for word, but they basically said to me, I disagree. I think I'm asking myself the right question. And I know, I felt that in my stomach, right? And it's like, ooh, okay, I really want to go toe to toe here, and I want to play like intellectual smarts with you. But actually, I think what I ended up saying was, and you're entitled to your opinion, and I'm entitled. Like we're like it's okay. It's okay to have differences here, and it's okay for me. I don't need to be right here. Although recognizing there was a part of me that was like, I know I'm right.
And
so we get wriggly around this stuff, right?
It's like a very thin margin many times. And I think, especially in a leadership position, I mean, traditionally in certain cultures, leaders are right. And that's the job of a leader. So, it's like, well, you have to defend your position then, which means, your openness to being wrong here might not be what you think it is.
Yeah.
And that's I think shows a lot of vulnerability and openness that it can actually go like that. I remember talking with a client recently, a prospective one. Sadly, we won't work together. He said, oh, if I'm wrong, I would love to know so I can correct my thing. And I was like, I looked straight at the person. I said, really? Do you really do that? I said, yeah, of course. I would be stupid not to. Probably remembered this because I was like surprised that someone in their position would be so open that they might quite often be wrong.
Yeah, but it's so funny. So I was thinking, like, in the one that I've been doing, I'm co-leading with someone. And what I notice, the the team in the room doing is going, yeah, I agree with you, or I agree with you, like the other person, like out of the co-leads.
Mm.
And it's like fascinating. It's like, wow, okay. So like it just makes me curious about what are we listening for? You know, are we listening to see who's right, who's got the, you know, like which opinion it's just some part of the kind of things that the filters that we have, or the, you know, over our lenses or over our ears that actually really don't help us, you know, because it really isn't about one of us being right and the other being wrong, but actually, you know, almost like I see people in the room wanting, you know, like wanting one of you to be right and one of you to be wrong. And you're like, oh, this is fascinating.
It is. And, you know, it's maybe as we're getting towards the end of our episode, it's a difficult one because it also has another dimension. It has a dimension of social status, how we're supporting each other, and so on. If I'm agreeing with you, it means that we're in the same boat and we're a team, right? You know, I'm supporting you in that. I remember way back when I was actually in a new contracting role with a couple of other contractors from the same consultancy, and we went into the client, and, you know, they were sort of interviewing us. It was a very mild and informal conversation, absolutely. And I remember when one person said something, one of my co-consultants, I said, well, yeah, that's quite a possibility. It can also be something different. And I essentially, you know, slightly disagreed with them. And they really held it against me afterwards. Because, you know, how am I undermining their position in front of a client? And, well, this just shows that in that particular environment, it wasn't something that was accepted, even though I think, you know, yeah, but, you know, one could say that, you know, everything has its own place. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. But on the other hand, I thought that this place and the character of the conversation warranted it. It just shows that, you know, disagreeing also creates the social distance, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, like if we accept that, you know, if we think about distance and nearness and, you know, how far are we from each other? How close are we from each other? And what's going to help us move more towards each other? You know, it's a helpful way to think about, you know, curiosity can be one of those things that help us. And also me saying, I hear you say this, you know, what is it you need? And all those kind of, all those active listening skills can really support us in those places to create more connection.
I absolutely can. And hopefully you've had a good listen to this episode of Leadership Within. And as always, we'd love to see you on the next one.